All right. And we are live. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon to all of the folks who've chosen to join us. Thank you for coming. I am absolutely thrilled to dive into today's topic. We have a great topic and, more importantly, a great speaker. And I am going to give a pre-warning that the both of us are talkers. So I'm unsure if there will be enough oxygen left in the room, but I do promise to do our best that after Pete and I riff back and forth, that we save a little time to open up for questions. So you should be able to put some questions into the Q&A into the chat if you're interested. But Pete, what do you say we dive in? You good to go?
I love it, and I always love getting to see the you have the most epic background of people that I get to meet with.
That's my safety picture. Everybody gets to ask about it. Some think it's a map. It's a picture of the Great Barrier Reef.
It's amazing.
But thank you for calling it out, because it just makes me feel at ease and comfort, and it's a safe thing for me to have behind me. So that's awesome.
I love it.
Thanks for throwing the topic up. Let me introduce the topic, and then I'll do a brief little intro of myself, and then give it to Pete to give a little overview on himself. So, data-driven sales coaching. It's 4 words, but there's a lot in those 4 words, especially for a simple sales guy like me. So let me break those down for a moment to give a little overview of what we're going to talk about. So data-driven, let's start with the first 2 words. So sales, as we all have seen, is evolving from the brute force, gut instinct days of trying to make decisions. And Pete, as you know, and you founded a company, you've written about this, you've guest lectured around this. We're using more than tools to just get data, but we are walking into meetings so much more informed today. So data-driven is the first part of our session. Now let's combine it with the next word, sales. Now sales is the pinnacle of functions that has served as the finger in the air, gray area of decision making in the past.
This is me shooting from the hip right now.
That is 100% it. That is it. We have, as sales leaders, it's always been this fairly undisciplined Wild West. But there's hope out there for all of us, because we are starting to see that, like finance or like a product organization, sales is now being optimized by data. So data-driven sales. And then the last part of this is coaching. Anybody that's written a book like Pete has here, that has commentary from people like Mark Roberge, who was the head of revenue at HubSpot, like Kyle Porter, the CEO and co-founder of SalesLoft, clearly knows a thing or two about coaching. And coaching, folks, coaching is a soft word for learning. And let me use that as a way to bring this all together. These sessions are designed to talk about leadership, about revenue leadership, and about learning. They're not here to push technology or any type of agenda. It's really about sharing, because Pete, myself, any of us that have gone through our careers have clearly had mentors, and we've had frameworks, we've had ideas put upon us to be able to help us grow ourselves. And that's what the goal of this session is to do today. So with that, let me quickly introduce myself, and then
please.
A lot of words to build up to that, but my name is Bill Binch. And I am an operator. I know my title here says operating partner at a venture capital firm, but prior to that, I spent 28 years in revenue roles, revenue leadership roles, and 6 months ago joined a venture capital firm to bring that experience, that knowledge, that wisdom, and be able to apply it back. So even though I'm an operating partner inside of a venture firm, it still means that I do what I've always done for the last nearly 30 years, and that's trying to help companies grow through their different stages. So that's me. Let me give it over here, Pete. I've been hogging up the mic here, so let me hand it over to you to share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the thing that you might have left out there in your intro, Bill, is that it's one thing to scale sales organizations, but the way that you do that is by hiring a metric ton of salespeople and helping them be successful and improve their performance. And so that means coaching them, right? Because like people, like they don't drop out of the womb like ready to rock, and they certainly don't like show up, at the organization, at your organization at the pinnacle of performance there. So like obviously you've been coaching a lot of reps and a lot of and then coaching managers to coach reps and helping helping folks be more successful. So I think that's a really important thing as relates to our topic. I haven't I haven't been around the block as many times as Bill, but I've been around the block a couple times. So my name is Pete Kazanjy. I'm the co-founder and CRO of Atrium. We make data-driven sales management software that like literally exists to help managers and leaders use metrics to improve rep and team performance. That's like my day job. How I got into this game is my background is actually in product management and product marketing. About a little bit more than a decade ago, I started my career in tech at a company called VMware, and then as a product marketer and product manager. And then subsequent to that, when I started my first software company, TalentBin, as a founder, I was kind of our first I was a business founder. And so the idea was like, okay, cool, someone's got to sell this software because apparently software doesn't sell itself. And like, who's that going to be? Oh, it's you. You're the guy who can't code. Okay, cool, go sell. And so what I did was like, that's kind of how I started my sales leadership journey, was as our first seller, our first sales manager, our first sales leader. We were acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014 when the company was about the sales organization was about 30 people. I then was responsible for new product sales at Monster Worldwide for a couple of years. During that time, I wrote a book on sales, kind of early stage sales management, sales and sales management, called Founding Sales. Essentially, it was the book that I wish that I had when I was trying to figure things out. And so now I run this software company, Atrium. I'm also the founder of the nation's largest sales leadership and operations community called Modern Sales. It's a 25,000 person peer education community that on all things kind of like modern sales. So that's a little bit about me. I'm really excited for this topic, but I think, Bill, what we kind of wanted to get into first before we have some slides here that we're kind of going to jam through, and I know that you and I are going to go back and forth on it, but I think that one of the things that you wanted to kind of touch on was kind of like why specifically coaching is so important, kind of like that last part of what you were talking about in the intro, why coaching, what coaching is and like why it's so important, and then we'll kind of get into like how data can augment that.
Yeah, 100%. I like attending webinars and events where there's tactical takeaways. And so that's what we're really hoping to achieve here today, is to do that, to be able to get tactical on ideas that you as a sales leader, a sales manager, a sales exec can take away from this session to be able to apply inside of your organization. So Pete, I think that's obviously the leadoff batter is, or in this case, our leadoff coach, Ted Lasso, of what is coaching and why it's important. Why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the big thing, I really liked your turn of phrase, Bill, about how like coaching is learning, because a lot of the time, for whatever reason, like when we get into like the professional realm, people start like kind of clenching around like teaching and kind of like changing people's behavior, like, oh, okay, I don't want to micromanage you, or like people are afraid of that sort of thing. Whereas if you think about like the world of athletics, and like, I'm a big sports fan. I grew up playing baseball, ski racing, and playing ultimate frisbee in college. um, that's the crux of how you improve performance, is like you observe a thing that's like not where it needs to be, you kind of coach in the right direction, and that's how we actually make everybody better. And that's like how that's how we change our organization at the individual human level in order to raise performance across the board. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to advance the argument to all y'all who are here today that that coaching is extraordinarily important, and then specifically data-driven coaching is extraordinarily important in terms of giving you leverage in your sales organizations. And so my hope is that at the end of this presentation, as I'm going through here and Bill is kind of adding his commentary from all of his experience, you'll come away from this convinced that this is the thing that you should be doing in your org. But don't listen to me, listen to Gartner, right? They're kind of important, right? why coaching is so important is because at the line manager level, the high performing managers are literally the difference between high performance and not. These are some of the things that come out of high performing managers. You get higher productivity, the reps are more likely to be top performers, better retention, better effort. And so managers are kind of the crux of this, your line managers, because those are literally the ones who are doing that coaching behavior. The challenge that we currently have right now is that for the most part, manager enablement and kind of like managers lack both the training and the tooling in order to do this data-driven coaching. And there's kind of two main reasons for that. One is that manager enablement ends up kind of being an afterthought. Most enablement resources, if they exist at all, go to the individual contributors. They go to the reps. Hey, let's go ahead and like train you up on objection handles, or like train you up on talk tracks or whatever, versus focusing those resources on the managers, like a train the trainer situation. And so that's oftentimes a big miss there in the part of these organizations. The second thing that we do that's not helpful for our managers is, in order to help them use data to manage, we give them tooling that is designed for analysts, right? For and by analysts. We give them what we like to call internally here at Atrium walls of charts for them to decipher. And I think the challenge, of course, with that is that if you think about where most sales managers come from, they come from account executives, SDRs, et cetera, none of whom really come from an analytical background. It's not to say that they can't be taught, but it goes back to that enablement thing about, most of those folks are not being enabled in that regard. And so the reason why this is problematic is because this is actually a really fantastic book that I'm a big fan of right now. It's by a woman named Michelle Vazana. She's also the co-author of Cracking the Sales Management Code, which is another absolutely fantastic book on data-driven sales, kind of like analysis and measurement. Her book Crushing Quota here is literally on sales coaching. And so this is like research from her consulting company is called Vantage Point. This is some of the commentary or some of the benefits associated with better management and better coaching. Whether it's the top 25% of managers generate 40% more revenue, which is a bunch more attainment. The interesting thing about this, though, is the way that they generate more revenue is that they get more reps to quota. Right? It's not that their top performers are performing higher. What they do is they take the people who are in the middle or at the bottom and they lift them up and get them successful. And the mechanism by which they do that is through better coaching. And so I think we're doing a giveaway here where if you want a copy of this book and some other ones as well, I'm a big sales nerd, as you might imagine. So I read a lot of sales books. We're going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat there. You're welcome to sign up for that if you'd like. So my hope is that you can kind of see from this behavior, from these statistics, this is why coaching is so important. And so then the question is like, okay, like what is coaching versus not? And so usually what coaching is about asking questions, like provocative. It's almost kind of like selling, asking provocative questions that maybe you know a little bit of the answer to, and kind of leading someone to what the realization of how they need to change and how their behavior needs to change, and then helping drive them in that direction, and then having an accountability loop after the fact to make sure that the coaching behavior that happened is actually sticking there. And so there's a couple of different examples here that I'm kind of can call out here. So when we think about pipeline inspection, oftentimes the questions there are like, hey, when's this particular deal coming in, versus asking what essentially is a discovery question about the deal in question. Say, hey, what are your concerns about this? Now you might actually have your own concerns about the specific deal, but asking them such that then you can pepper things in. Hey, can you make this forecast bigger? What does that actually mean? Do you want the person to like fudge deals and enlarge the amounts, or did you want them to mark something in a commit that actually isn't committed? Or what are we trying to actually understand what's going on here and think about how we can potentially resolve that and fix that? So, hey, these are forecast pacing behind are the things we can do to pull these forward. And so I'm not going to go through all of these, but the idea here being, can we ask people appropriate questions that reveal to them the gap in their behavior or in the current state that then characterizes to them why they need to change, and then kind of guide them in the appropriate direction for that. So that's a little bit on like coaching versus not. So then the next question is like, okay, well, how do we add in data to this, right? Because a lot of this right here is around inspection. And so when you think about what data-driven management is, there's a couple of like capabilities that and behaviors that managers should be doing, some of which they do naturally. Managers don't need reminding to do deal inspection and strategy. It's oftentimes the thing that they are most prone to do because they come from an AE background or what have you. But there's actually like a whole bunch of other stuff that they need to be spending their time doing, like tracking progress towards goals, right, on leading indicators, and kind of reporting out on that, whether that's on a weekly or a monthly or a quarterly basis, or doing one-on-ones that are distinct from deal inspections, that are distinct from pipeline reviews. So database, like what we like to call database one-on-ones, where we're having a one-on-one, we're having coaching conversations, but they're focused on specific metrics that inform a behavior that you're trying to change. It means monitoring the ramp of new hires. So new hires are obviously an extraordinarily, the new hire ramp period is an extraordinarily like dicey period of an AE's kind of existence. And so monitoring how they're coming into band is extraordinarily important versus saying like, hey, I'm going to check in 6 months and see if they've gotten to full productivity. That's more of a risky way of approaching that. And then the last kind of two things here, it's two sides of the same coin, is really about like, once somebody's ramped and on their merry way, it's seeing where there are issues and then intervening there in order to fix somebody who's maybe falling off or maybe has a hitch in their giddy up. And then on the flip side, taking what defines your high performers aside, not just like, hey, look, they book a ton of revenue, or like as an SDR, they create a ton of pipeline, they create a bunch of ops, but essentially the behaviors and the precursors there. So taking that fingerprint of success and then standardizing it across the rest of the team. And so the problem, of course, so like that's a lot of stuff for a manager to be doing, in addition to all the other fun stuff like, Bobby broke up with his girlfriend and is now like super grumped up or whatever, like, so-and-so is going to go on pat leave, and like all the other chaos that is your life as a sales manager, right? But this is a lot of stuff that folks need to really be spending their time doing. And so the challenge is that without that appropriate enablement and tooling, this is kind of what most managers end up doing, right? Talking about deals. And so what my claim to everyone here would be is that this is a very legacy way of approaching this. And I think actually Bill was talking about this earlier around like, actually Bill was talking about his, I hope I'm not going to like ruin the surprise, but he's got a cool session that's coming up at SaaStr here in Barcelona. And there's the things that worked in the past, and then that like still work, and then there's the things that worked in the past that like don't work anymore. Right. And so just like talking deals is like, that's important, but it leaves out all these other things. Wouldn't you agree, Bill?
100%. I really like, Pete, the collaborative element. Like when you go to the difference between coaching and not, like the idea where you said, hey, instead of how can you make the forecast bigger? That is so me sitting across the table from you.
Sure.
And that's the classic manager to subordinate versus the idea there of like, what are your ideas of how we could grow this? That's bringing you around to this side of the table. We're now shoulder to shoulder. Let's ideate. Let's just visualize and gameplay out some ideas of what we can do to make this deal bigger. It's just such a difference. And it's funny because of word choice there. Because you probably have the same intent in your heart, but it's just different. Sure. And what it does is it reminds me of my last company. We had a sales leader, and Pete, it's exactly what you said. It's a sales rep that had been around for a bunch of years, had been really successful. He was promoted up into a manager role, and his first 3 quarters missed quota. So we had this great performance of an individual who now is a frontline sales manager missing. And I remember we cared about this person. So his boss me, and then my CEO all took different looks at him. And my CEO
Yep.
listened to gong calls and picked up on a couple of things like, hey, when competition comes up, he reacts as opposed to leads through. When pricing comes up, he quickly goes to discounting. So he picked up on a couple of patterns that were data
Yep.
based. His boss, of course, was in there talking about the standard pipeline and deals and things like that,
Sure.
trying to help him to think about how he was doing that. And what I went at was, we had just rolled out the Medic sales methodology by Force Management. And I remember asking the sales leader, I said, what do you want to be remembered for as a sales manager? And he thought, geez, as a sales rep, it was always of being the guy that closed the big deal or closed the highest percentage. He said, but as a manager, it's exactly what you said. It was about getting the most amount of reps to their quota.
Sure.
And I said, great, how are you doing on that? And he said, not well. And I said, what do you think are some ideas? Because I have a few in my head that we could do to get you to be remembered like that. And I think that was my idea, to bring him to my side of the table, that I wasn't going to yell at him, but that I was gonna try and help him. And we riffed on some ideas, and I came back and said, listen, give me a ranking on 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the best. We just rolled out Force. Where are you as a sales manager on adhering to the systems and the processes? And he said, I'm about a 6. And I said, I would have guessed the same thing. And I said, listen, you're 3 quarters into your role. You haven't made your quota in this role. If we have to have this conversation a couple quarters from now, it's going to be a completely different conversation. And I think you know what that means. So as I try to give you coaching on what you can do differently to improve performance, you have a bunch of young sellers earlier in their career that I would push this incredible gift we've given them of bringing in this sales methodology, of getting them to be as absolute pro level, because that's your legacy. That's your leave behind, that when they go and work at some other place, which they will, they will at least remember that I had this boss that was maybe a bit rigorous on me on injecting in sales methodology. And the great side of that story is, a couple quarters later, we didn't have to have that other conversation, because all of a sudden he was now running the playbook that we had helped craft with the group that brought it in from outside. And his team was now starting to achieve those quotas. And I looked at that session, I look back at that session, Pete, and I think data-driven sales coaching, because the CEO went and listened to his phone calls that he was working on with his reps. His manager was turning the crank of understanding his pipeline, understanding his deals, helping him think through how he could coach people, as opposed to being the super rep and trying to go run and do it themselves.
Not scalable.
And then I was lastly there with methodology and thinking about how he builds his brand as a sales leader. And that to me was the collaborative side of data-driven sales coaching.
Yeah, totally. And I think what you were doing there is, like, you were enabling him as a manager. And so I think that folds really well with some of the stuff we're going to talk about here next. Is like, one, clearly this was a recently promoted IC who hadn't been sufficiently enabled. You had a meta coaching conversation about coaching with him, which is obviously really important. And of course, then the next thing is like, okay, well then how would we help him use data with his reps in order to understand where people are lacking and what have you, in order to apply that, like, hey, where are people light with respect to their pipeline? Where are people light with respect to their opportunity progressions? Where are people light on their MedPIC scoring and what have you? And I think what you kind of talked about, it's funny, like Bill has not seen these slides, but like you can tell that we're kind of singing from the same hymnal here, because there's a lot of things here that speak to that. Like, so the reason why it's important to use data to coach, right, is because closing deals for your reps is low leverage. There's only one of you. Right? There's only one of you. And like, if you got 6 reps, you got 8 reps, you got 10 reps, what have you, like, you can't be on all their closing calls. Like, and moreover, by the time you're on those closing calls, like, guess what? The deal is either won or lost in disco anyway. So that's very, very low leverage. Similarly, recurring deal inspection only shows you a deal by deal snapshot. Well, like, one of my favorite jokes about this is, it's like the blind men kind of trying to figure out, like, they're all touching the elephant. There's like five blind men. They're like, oh, I'm feeling him back here, and like, it feels like a snake on his tail, and oh, I'm feeling his ear over here. And so what you're doing is you're trying to understand what's going on at a rep on a deal by deal snapshot, versus like looking holistically at their metrics in order to say, like, oh man, you have this problem right here. I'm going to solve this problem right here, right? Even like riding along on calls is really low leverage. Obviously, with call recording software, that can be very powerful, because what you can do is you can listen to the ones that are important at certain points in time for a given rep, and also you can listen to them at 1.5x, which is even which is very helpful versus riding along. But it still is a lower leverage kind of approach there. And then the last thing that is kind of challenging is, especially in a remote environment, just kind of like instrumentation via osmosis. Like, oh, is the sales floor loud? That doesn't really exist for a lot of organizations anymore. And so this is for all of these kind of shortfalls right here. This is why what we need to do is use data in order to manage and coach these reps. And so the great thing about with data is that with data, you can see around corners, right? You can kind of get ahead of things. And then also you have a feedback loop. You can say, hey, did that stick? So like in the coaching conversation Bill had with that manager, he's like, yeah, you know what? I'm at a 5 or a 6 with respect to rolling out of Medic, okay, or MedPick. Cool. Well, what would be the data that would indicate to us that we're having more success there on those individual reps? Well, it might be opportunities getting to certain stages. It might be reporting on which opportunities have which MedPick fields filled out. And then of course, like the downstream impact of that would probably be things around like win rate. Like, is our win rate getting better, or are we just like putting in more calories? Right, we're like taking more at bats, but our batting average like still kind of sucks because we're not adopting the methodology. The point is that with data, we can kind of see where the shortfall is, coach to it, and then also see if it's sticking there. And so the way that one of the metaphors that I like to use when talking about that like feedback loop, again, I kind of told you, kind of sales nerdy here. One of my favorite books on agile management and kind of like situational awareness and iteration is a book called Boyd. It's about the John Boyd, who's a fighter pilot and also kind of the innovator around specific fighter pilot doctrine, and like airborne combat doctrine around what he coined was like the OODA loop, right? So it's observe, orient, decide, and act. And so the idea here is what you're doing is, again, this is as a fighter pilot, but it actually applies to startups. It applies to pretty much any like market actor, is you're observing what the situation is in the world, right? The way that you do that is either with your eyes or you use data to do this. You then orient around that, like you reason against it. You then decide on an action, like, okay, this is unsatisfactory. I'm going to do something about this. And then you take that action, and then you have to loop back again, right? And that's this notion of like continually looping like that in order to get things better. And so Eric Ries kind of talks about this in the Lean Startup, which is obviously a really impactful entrepreneurship book. But this same sort of approach can be applied to data-driven sales management as well. And so the whole idea here is to drive better results. And so this is kind of like examples of what this looks like, where in sales management without data, it's kind of like, oh man, I didn't see that. Like in Bill's case, it's like, hey man, we're 3 quarters in and like, what's up, right? We're gonna inspect a little bit. I'm gonna ask some questions. Again, I'm not necessarily data-based here. One of the biggest things that people don't appreciate is, how do you know if you're right? Because this is the challenge, especially with like junior managers. You got a 28-year-old manager, a 30-year-old manager, what have you. They don't want to be the asshole, right? So they're like, oh man, you got your opinion, I got my opinion, and I feel a little bad about it. How do I know if I'm right or not? And then they're just like paralyzed. And so like this is not a good recipe for success here. And so the better approach, of course, is that to use data here. You can actually see something's weird. You can observe and be like, whoa, that's weird. That rep's win rate sucks, right? And his conversion rate out of disco sucks as compared to everybody else. That's weird. Something's weird over here. I'm going to go ahead and dig into the data, right? Oh, his win rate is problematic. Why is his win rate problematic? Oh, well, it actually looks like his win rate is problematic because he has conversion rate problems out of disco and conversion rate problems out of proposal. In the middle of the funnel, he's okay. Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to listen to some of those disco calls. Then I'm going to listen to some of those proposal calls and figure out what's going on there. Oh man, that's the problem. He's skipping 3 of our disco questions. What? right? Like that's the problem. And so what we can do is we can fix that. And so and then what we do is we loop back again. We say, hey, you know what? I observed X, Y, Z. It seems like you're skipping some of these disco questions right here. You can see that that shows up later on in the pipe, like later on in the funnel when, you know, it turns out that this was never a qualified opportunity because you skipped these questions right here. What I want you to do is I want you to adhere to that. Here's that Google document. And I want you to record those calls. Like, sorry, Gong and Course are going to record it for you. I want you to send me the next 5 or 10 disco calls where you're adhering to that script. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to validate that for you. And then moreover, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that conversion rate out of disco, right, in a month, in 2 months from now, and we're going to see if that remediated, right? And that's the loop back there. And so that's the preferred, that's the modern way of doing management and coaching with data. And what we're doing is we're improving that rep's performance to help to, again, change their behavior the same way. Like, Bill, I really liked your metaphor about sitting on the same side of the, like when Tom Brady and Bill Belichick are like looking at their Microsoft Surface, you know, right before Tom Brady throws it on the ground or whatever, they're not like across the table from each other. They're sitting side by side looking at that last play or like looking at the metrics in order to figure out like what the deal is. And so, and then such that when Tom Brady goes back out on the field or goes out for the next, you know, the next series, we have improved performance there. And so this is this is the modern approach here. Did you have anything you wanted to comment on here, Bill?
Yeah. I think as sales leaders, we all talk about ideal customer profile. It's occurring to me now, Pete, that you're essentially defining a new acronym, an ICS, an ideal coaching session, as we go through this. And that goes back to the intro statements that I made, that sales was always this gut instinct, you know, just find a way type of mindset. And that's, I think, the evolving shift that we're doing, because if you look at just modern business over the last 30, 40 years, you know, ERP brought optimization to the whole finance and the supply chain area. HR as a function got hire to retire systems, payroll, recruiting, and talent systems. You look at marketing, got marketing automation. You look at product ops, DevOps, all that's happening today. Sales has been no slouch. Sales obviously started with CRM, and it's grown from there. But again, it was looking at a lot of backwards data. It was looking at a lot of trailing indicators. And so that's what I think that this data is helping us, like you said on the slide a few minutes ago, I noted it said, help us see around corners. It's helping us give visibility to what things are going to happen.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the, it was so funny when you were talking through your coaching conversation with that manager. What was funny is like you were doing discovery with him or her. Right? You're like, hey, what's the situation? How would you grade where you're at right now? What are the negative implications associated with like not getting there? Right? What are like the positive impacts? And like, it's funny. My buddy Corey Bray wrote this book called 5 Secrets of the Sales Coach. It's another one of my favorite sales management books, that it's all about, like, they have a coaching framework called Coach. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's kind of the same sort of stuff. But what you want to do, of course, is you want to layer data into that such that, like, you know what you're going to coach about going into those conversations. The same way that, like, going into a good disco conversation, like, you've done your account research and you kind of know what the lay of the land is. And so, like, we're like leading people to versus like, hey, tell me your priorities. It's like, hey, you know, Bill, based on what I read in the 10K, you know, what I saw on LinkedIn, it feels like, you know, you guys might be in a situation like some of our customers around XYZ. Am I thinking about that right? Yeah. And so obviously this topic is like what we think about very much at Atrium, just to kind of give folks a little bit of a overview in that regard. What our claim is that, like, managers need to be data driven. AE managers, SDR managers, AM, CSM managers need to be data driven. Like, what it is so important that they need to have very specific tooling that is designed for this. What our claim would be is that they need to have every KPI that matters already pre-made for them. They don't need to be waiting on somebody else to make some reporting for them. And then, more important, what they need to have is this stuff needs to be being monitored for them. So the goals that have been set need to be proactively tracked for them so that information can come for them. So rather than them having to go and like look at a wall of charts, there needs to be early warning alerting on various KPIs to help them understand like, hey, this rep's win rate is off, or this rep's conversion rate is off, or this rep's average opportunity size is much smaller than everybody else's. That's probably going to be a problem in 90 days. And then lastly, do that automated performance diagnosis for them. Like, hey, this rep's bookings issue is coming from a low win rate in higher opportunity sizes. He has a problem around big ops. Either A, you got to only feed him small ops, or B, we got to fix this big op win rate here. Doing that sort of like data-driven diagnosis. And so the important thing, like these are all the things that managers need in order to be successful. Our thought is that this is literally what Atrium is designed to do. We work with hundreds and hundreds of companies to help their managers do exactly that, right? To bring that Moneyball moment to sales. Cool. So then like the next kind of topic that I want to touch on here in the like the last 15 minutes that we have is like, okay, cool. If that's what data-driven coaching kind of looks like, how do we systematize this? How do we actually make this happen? And so then the first question is like, okay, well, how do you systematize observation? And so there's a couple of different ways of doing this. The traditional way of doing this is CRM reporting. The good thing about that is that it's available now, it's ready to go. The downside is that it has to be built, right? That you have to get the data prepared. You gotta build all the reporting, all the dashboard, and then lastly, someone's actually got to bird dog it. The same is kind of true with business intelligence. It's just kind of a more muscular version of the above. Our claim is that the modern way of doing this is with data-driven, like purpose-made data-driven sales management software that takes very little time to set up. That's actually something I neglected to mention earlier. Is Atrium takes about 5 minutes to set up. Anybody can just sign in with their Salesforce account and have a world-class metrics harness. The downside associated with this is a little bit less flexible. Right. So unlike, you can build anything in business intelligence, but you got to build it. There's a little bit less flexibility in kind of like purpose-made data-driven sales management software, but importantly, it's monitored for them. So then the question is like, how do we actually systematize this? So if we have the assets in place, great. How do we make that happen? And so one of the things that I talk about quite a bit in my sales organization is this notion of, we have a term called calendar is destiny. Oh wait, it's right here. Calendar is destiny. And if you don't make space on the calendar for that consumption and that observation to happen, it's never going to happen. This is just like some examples of what an operating rhythm might look like here, whether it's a pipeline review that happens on a weekly basis, or deal strategy meetings, or like, again, a one-on-one that is different from a deal review, but instead is reviewing metrics and progress and coaching initiatives, or a QBR meeting. Bill, what was what were your favorite operating rhythm kind of like meeting, like high profile meetings that you like to have in your sales organizations?
Yeah, I liked from the top down, to me, everything pivoted off of what happened in the C-suite, which is typically a Monday meeting. I liked having my direct team meeting right after that because there was no lossage of data. I could immediately take any relevant and put to them. And then at that point, that session, aside from me sharing, was a weekly session where they could build the agenda. So we would talk about them as a group, being able to bring up. From there, I would break down and I would have individual meetings with each of my functional leaders. So I would go through their different businesses, which I think I would say, if I analogize this, deal strategy meeting, I'm sorry, it'd probably be more like the strategy meeting would be like my team meeting. The one-on-one meeting would be exactly what you're talking about here with like HR topics, review metrics and things like that. And then of course we all got back together weekly on a forecast call. So you could call that as either the pipeline review or like a quarterly, but it was a weekly type of meeting. So that was my type of cadence. But I'll share one with the group here that I really enjoyed that a lot of my managers did is they would crowdsource a deal. And what they would do is, aside from their weekly team meetings and their weekly one-on-ones, they would take one deal, typically a deal that was juicy, maybe had a little hair on it. They would bring the whole team together to crowdsource, like show us the gap. Because like, as you know, as a sales manager, a lot of times you get into your routine of you ask these questions, and you forget to ask something. And then all of a sudden an outsider comes in, they go, wait, what about this? And they pull something else in there. And so I always loved that idea too, because it just kept the team fresh. It kept the team focused on, this might not be my deal, but I'm going to help the organization and the good of the cause. So I like that one as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. I mean, I think this is kind of goes to the point around like making space on the calendar in order to do certain behaviors, right? So like what we were talking about right there is like, enablement of reps. So kind of helping reps do a better job of like understanding the patterns in a deal and then doing that in a public setting such that everybody can kind of learn from it. The metaphor that I use there, of course, is just like film review, right? So on a football, in a traditional football environment, it happens in other sports as well. Like you watch film as a team together and then call out the fact that this lineman who's literally sitting in that meeting right there missed this block right here. And the purpose of that is not to like put him on the spot or whatever, blow up his spot, but it's to help everybody understand, okay, here's the issue right here. And then of course do the flip side as well, which is high performance. Like, hey, look at this particularly good route that happened right here. Look at this particular behavior. There was a question earlier regarding the kind of like what an ideal operating rhythm would look like there. I forget, it disappeared, but oh, it's over here under answered. Yeah, Brian asked a question around like subsets, whatever. I mean, I kind of think about it almost kind of like a Chinese menu where you can kind of like pick and choose. The way that like I have this set up, like my operating rhythm is we have our go-to-market team leads meeting on Monday morning. So it's like my AE team lead, my SDR team lead, my customer success team lead. These are all people that have around like a dozen or so folks in the organization. Then there are team meetings that happens, probably not dissimilar to what Bill was talking about. Our AE team meeting or sales team meeting is at like 11. Actually, no, it's at noon now on Monday. And so the content of that's the AEs and the SDRs. The content of that meeting is looking at metrics in the past week, looking at progress towards, other things. As well, there's like a whole meeting agenda that have like hyperlinks off to a bunch of like Atrium reports and dashboards and what have you. Cool. Then throughout the week, what I have is deal strategy meetings, so half-hour deal strategy meetings with each of the account executives to like look at particularly hairy deals. That's not a public one. It's like, hey, what are the 5 deals that you need help on right now? Maybe there's a little inspection there. We actually have like a team-based pipeline review where we it's really more of like a data check and kind of like calling things out around like, hey, are the close dates right? Are the stages right? And then of course, what comes out of that is a bunch of people are like, oh man, like I have dirty laundry. And then like a bunch of like updates happen during that meeting or like after that meeting or what have you. I do have one-on-ones, half-hour one-on-ones every other week with those individuals. I have one-on-one specific dashboards and assets that are in those one-on-one documents. So like in any given rep has like a specific coaching initiative that we're working on at any given point in time. And like that usually will be a tile on that dashboard in question, like, oh, we're working on your talk listen ratio and Gong. It's like we have a couple tiles on that. We have a Gong integration with Atrium. And like we're looking at that. Is your talk listen ratio getting better? Or is it getting worse? Like, is that coaching, like, is that sticking? And so that's different on a per rep basis. And then, yeah, we'll have QBRs on a quarterly basis, and then that Monday morning sales team meeting at the close of a month is more of like a month look back there. So I think the upshot is, Brian, that like an operating rhythm has a bunch of these things in place because what they do is they compel consumption and they essentially compel this behavior, right? What you're doing is you're putting space on the calendar to compel that behavior there. So I hope that answered that question. The last thing we're going to kind of talk about now is like the orientation and decision, right? So what we talked about here is like how do we systematize observation? So the next thing is like, okay, well, how do we orient and then act? Because if this is a less common problem that managers have. This is usually a problem that like sales operations or data analysts will have, is that they're good at like consuming the information, but they're not necessarily great at like reasoning against it and then like providing a prescription. And so what we're going to talk about is like how you can kind of how you can kind of do this. So kind of the traditional mechanism by which you get good at like reading data is to kind of like look for issues. And so then the question is like, okay, well, like what does an issue look like in some of these visualization scenarios? Well, those can be things like, hey, this bar is bigger than everybody else's. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous. Like, yeah, duh, Pete. No, it's actually like, without explaining it to folks, like that cannot necessarily be super obvious. So looking for areas of outperformance here, where you have, and like this right here is customer facing meeting volume right here. You've got a rep who's like outperforming everybody else. That's fantastic. This would be an example of, hey, what's he doing that's different than everybody else? Like, what's the root cause of this? Because gotta be honest, not only does he have more meetings, he's also got more first meetings than everybody else. That feels really good to me. In fact, if we could get everybody else having that many first meetings and that many like follow-up meetings, man, I think that that would probably drive more bookings. So first, hey, what's going on here? And then now, guess what? We have a coaching conversation. In this case is like a demo name right here. Like in my next one-on-one with Cyril, or alternatively, I might take a screenshot of it and be like, hey, high five, you're kicking ass. Hey, what's going on there? Like, what's the secret to your success? Cool. On the flip side, if you have somebody who's underperforming, same sort of situation. Usually in those sort of situations, like a singular data point is not going to be sufficient to kind of come off the top rope and be like, oh man, like clearly there's a problem here. And that's where things like trends can be really important. And so this other tile here on the right here is just a bunch of these same reps trended out. And so really quickly, what you can kind of see here is a couple of different things happening here. So like this rep right here, Winnie the Pooh, is highly performing with respect to customer facing meeting volume, kind of across the board there. And in fact, also highly performant even as these other folks deteriorate. So that indicates to me, again, something for me to investigate here as a manager, like, hey, why is this person outperforming in that regard? Can I get other folks to do that as well? Similarly, what you can, when you're looking at trends, if you have a consistent trend over time, which we can kind of see here with some of these reps down here at the bottom, we have consistent underperformance with respect to customer facing meeting volume, right? It's not like somebody went on, went on vacation, was like, down, back up again. Okay, no big deal, right? That's like why this right here would not necessarily be a sufficient thing for me to want to investigate and say like, oh man, like, or sorry, come off the top rope and say, what's going on here? There's a huge problem, because they might be out, et cetera, et cetera. But if you have multiple weeks or multiple months wherein the same underperformance is happening as a delta compared to everybody else on that team, from an apples to apples standpoint, well, that's something that we would want to investigate. Similarly, and probably act on earlier. Similarly, if we see a specific downward trend over time, that's the same sort of situation there. And so these are some like kind of basic examples of how to do that. A kind of more modern way of doing this is to actually do statistical analysis or have like anomaly detection that's kind of in place. This is one of the benefits of data-driven sales management software, is like it could, like, we're using our eyeballs to do this like anomaly detection right here. Well, it's all just math. Why not just have a computer do the anomaly detection for us? That can be a more performant way or a more proactive way of doing it. The last thing I was going to kind of note on here to kind of wrap is, when you're doing the investigation, and Bill was kind of touching on this earlier around leading indicators, as things have gotten more and more modern and more data is being captured, rather than just looking at lagging indicators like bookings as an example, or even kind of like intermediary lagging indicators like wins or win rate or what have you, because we're capturing more data on rep performance, whether it's like activity data like customer facing meeting volumes or emails or what have you, or even things like leading indicators to wins like opportunity progressions and opportunity conversion rates. There's all of these upstream KPIs, and it's very similar to if anybody's like paid attention to various professional athletics analytics revolutions. It's very similar to the growth of fancy stats in baseball or hockey or basketball, what have you. There's a number of other stats that are upstream from these kind of meat and potato statistics here. And so what you can do when you're investigating here is you can kind of go right. We call this the driver tree. You can go right and you can say, hey, this person's pacing poorly on bookings. or maybe they're not even, right? Like maybe like everything's still hunky dory, but for whatever reason, their wins look like they're falling off. Oh, okay. Why are their wins falling off? Well, is it coming from a win rate problem, like a batting average problem, or is it the number of at bats they're getting? Oh, it's coming from a win rate problem. Okay, well, where's that coming from? Well, let's go upstream. Is that coming from a pipeline hygiene problem? Do they have too many untouched opportunities? Is it coming from a multi-threading problem? Are they not sufficiently multi-threading in their accounts? You can see that their contacts per account KPIs are much lower than their peers, or is it coming from something maybe totally different, like an opportunity conversion problem? Like where's the root cause here? And so by going upstream and looking for those root causes, what we can do is we can get ahead of that and fix the actual problem, rather than just kind of like throwing our hands up and saying like, hey, this person's got a win rate problem or what have you. The last thing I want to kind of touch on here is this notion of like, how do we loop back? Because what we were just talking about is like, hey, we're going to read this, we're going to detect, we're going to go to our root causes, and then we're going to fix that. And so really that's where that's like the work that the one-on-one does. And so what we have there is, I have a meeting template, a one-on-one coaching meeting template here that I think Hannah's going to throw into the chat room here. But the idea here is that we want to create a place on the calendar where what we're doing is we're filling out those topics along with like hyperlinks to the relevant assets in order to say, hey, you know what? This is the rep topic that, the rep in this is an example, like a prototypical example. The rep is like, hey, I feel like I'm light on ops. I've never heard that from a rep before. Right? Maybe the manager topic is like, hey, these are the things that I want to cover here. Your prospecting activity. Also, don't forget to register for health insurance. We have our current coaching area of emphasis. Specifically, what we're focusing on is we're focusing on pipe hygiene as measured by untouched opportunities. And then importantly, what we can see is we prescribe a next action. We say, hey, we're going to put time on our calendar where what you're going to do is you're going to have 2 1-hour blocks where you're doing pipe management. We're going to hyperlink to whether it's a CRM report or an Atrium report or whatever, and like you're going to be doing this. And then what's going to happen is we're going to loop back on a recurring basis in order to say, hey, how are we doing on that metric? How are we doing on that metric? How are we doing on that metric? And so that's how you loop back and compel that, and by doing this, eventually what you'll do is you'll retire that coaching problem. Oh, this person no longer has a pipeline hygiene problem. Well, guess what? They'll have a new problem. It might not be a problem. It'll be a new area of improvement, but that's okay. There's always a new area of optimization, and that's literally the mechanism by which we get these reps to success. Right? Is by taking each part of the hitch in their giddy up, identifying it, and then fixing it. And the mechanism by which we do that is through ongoing data-driven coaching. So those are all the slides we want to cover. I think, Bill, there was like one thing that we wanted to talk about around like what are our desert island metrics, and then I think we wanted to open it up for questions.
Yeah, I think maybe we pass on that, Pete, because I think we've.
Sure.
I did say at the beginning of the session there would be no lack of content or no content in this session. So
no lie.
There were a couple of questions that came up, and so I want to make sure we touched on those. Charity Lee asked, one thing I'm trying to make better is pinpointing the right data points and being prescriptive based on that. How do you suggest we find the right data points that roll up with our sales OKRs? Now, Pete, I'll give it to you in a second, but Charity, I'll just give you a quick idea. Big topic. I could probably talk about this for 15, 20 minutes, but I'll try and give you something that I really think about. Whenever I'm being interviewed by a sales rep to join my organization, a very common question is, tell me what a successful sales rep looks like. And that's been just a consistent question across my career. And so I thought about that my last couple of companies, and I actually asked my RevOps team to go look at and say, what are the things that differentiate our successful from our less successful?
Yep.
One that they came up with, and Pete, I talked about it, you reinforced it, I'll reinforce it again. This is a leading indicator one, but they found that our top reps, when they woke up on Monday morning, their calendar looked something like this. They had 2 or 3 Cisco calls, they had 2 or 3 demo calls, 2 or 3 price or value delivery calls, and maybe 1 or 2 negotiation and close calls. And so we were able to say to our new hires and to people interviewing, what does a successful rep look like? This is what it looks like. And what it specifically wasn't to me is it wasn't looking at how many calls you made or how many meetings you had to get to that. It just said, look, you want the ideal of what the reps that consistently make quota look like. This is what their calendars look like. And what that did was it put it upon that sales rep to be able to say, okay, I need to back into that. And like, obviously as a brand new rep, you start with 0. And so we would say, hey, at the end of your 4th week, we'd like to see you have a couple of discovery calls. By the end of your 8th week, we'd like to see a couple discovery, couple demo calls to start the week. By the end of your 12th week, this is where we're at, and be prescriptive of how they should be thinking about building themselves up to being a consistently performing sales rep. So Jerry, like I said, a lot of things in your question there, but that's one that's, I think, very forward looking and makes you think about managing your reps to not how many phone calls or how many meetings they're setting, but what kind of meetings and what does that look like versus your other sales reps.
Yeah, fully. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think Steven had another interesting question here around like, do reps have access to some of this data? And then my response to that is like, yeah, like, I mean, self-management and self-orientation can be a very powerful thing that, you know, in the right hands. Now you need to have an effective like culture of data, like that can be like, depending on what your organization looks like, they can maybe be like cannonballing into the jacuzzi a little bit there. But I think like giving reps kind of access to that, especially in a post Strava, post Peloton, post like Whoop world. One thing I just wanted to note on, this is actually a demo instance right here of Atrium. And so Bill, you were kind of talking about like, what is an effective ramping rep look like here? This is like, you know, this is an organization that has a number of reps that are ramping right here, and you can kind of see these are the new hires and how they're ramping as compared to some of the other reps that have ramped previously. And so like, this is opportunity ownership, but you know, this is why stage advancements end up being a pretty important thing to kind of like look at, is how are people, how are they advancing those opportunities? And then specifically, are there key stages where people are, you know, that you would expect them to be getting to? And so this is kind of like the opportunity stage based version of what you were talking about around like, hey, what does your calendar look like? Oh, well, I've got some proposal calls, right? Like we wouldn't expect that until maybe month 3, but if you're in month 3 and you don't have any proposal calls going, like I'm a little worried, right?
Look, I have to react to that one piece there, Pete, where the question that Steven asked about sharing the data. I first of all am a big believer of a transparent culture. I can't tell you how many sales calls I went on early in my career, or I should say coaching meetings, where I walked in and the manager had some piece of data that I didn't, and they sneak attacked me. And it was like, I don't know if it's their way of feeling that I'm superior to you, but it was like, why wouldn't you give that to me to make this session bigger, better? And instead,
we're on the same side of the table, looking at the same screen.
Yeah, I'm reacting, I'm defensive. So I am a big believer. Like, to me, it's about expectations, Stephen. If you're still on, I think it's about being clear on expectations. And if you're walking into a meeting with access to the same data that I have, then, you know, then at least at that point, we can both look at it from that same side of the table.
Yeah, for sure. Killer Bill, well, this is super fun. We'll have to do it again. Like I was saying, we were saying in the pre-conversation, we'll do it with the modern sales community. For folks who joined us, thank you very much. You can find me and Bill on LinkedIn. If you have a sales organization, you know, that's greater than like 5 to 10 reps, I would encourage you to check out Atrium. You can set up your own account within 5 minutes. If you use Salesforce as your CRM, you can be on your merry way there. And then also, if you'd like a copy of Crushing Quota and actually a couple of other sales books, I think we're going to drop a hyperlink into the chat here for folks to sign up for that. But otherwise, folks, thank you very much for taking the time, and hope you guys learned some stuff.
Have a great week, everybody.
Okay, later, Bill.
Bye-bye.